bricks that change colour, a tenant named Mr. Chicken, a bomb, and a rebuild so insane that what you're looking at right now isn't even the original building.
So here's the question we're answering today. Was 10 Downing Street ever a normal house?
Before there was Downing Street, there wasn't even a street here. This was all part of Whitehall Palace, the main London home of Tudor and Stuart kings and queens.
And the very first building on this exact spot wasn't even a house. It was a brewery run by an abbey that got shut down in the 1500s.
Then, in 1581, Elizabeth I leased the house on site to a man named Sir Thomas Knivet.
Doesn't ring a bell? Here's why it should.
Knivet was the man who arrested Guy Fawkes and uncovered the Gunpowder Plot in 1605.
So, centuries before any Prime Minister ever stepped foot, this exact address had already changed English history once. So, where did the name Downing Street come from?
Well, that's from a man named Sir George Downing. Spy, diplomat, and by most accounts, not a very likeable guy.
He worked for Oliver Cromwell first, and then switched sides and worked for King Charles II. Either way, he made a fortune.
And like most rich men in 17th century London, he put that fortune into property.
In 1682, he hired Sir Christopher Wren, the guy who designed St. Paul's Cathedral, to help design a row of terraced townhouses on the land.
Here's the part people don't expect. Downing Street wasn't a grand project. It was actually a cheap rental. 15 to 20 of identical brick houses put up fast for what Downing calls persons of good quality.
And they were built fast and cheap on boggy ground, right next to the Thames, with foundations way too shallow for what was sitting on top of them.
Hold on to that detail because it comes back in a big way.
One of those identical houses is now what we call number 10. At this point, it's nothing. It's just another rental, home to a rotating number of minor nobles that nobody remembers.
So how does a rental townhouse become the most famous address in Britain? One man, Robert Walpole.
Walpole was the first Lord of the Treasury. Basically, he was Prime Minister before even the title existed.
In 1732, King George offered him a grand house facing Horse Guards Palace, plus the little townhouse behind it as a gift.
And Walpole said no.
Not because he didn't want it, but because he was smarter than that. He asked the king to give it to the office instead, whoever held the job of First Lord of the Treasury. Forever, not him personally.
That one choice is the reason the house is attached to the job and not to the man. It's why, to this day, the deed still technically says the First Lord of the Treasury.
But before Walpole could move in, the house physically needed to become one house. And that involved a man named Mr. Chicken.
I promise that's real. Mr. Chicken was the first tenant of the cottage next door. Walpole had to talk him into moving out so the plot would be big enough to build on.
Architect William Kent then gutted the entire thing, joined the big house to the little townhouse, and added a grand staircase. 3 years and about £20,000 later in 1735, and it was complete. Walpole finally moved in.
Happy ending, right? Nope.
For over 100 years after that, Downing Street was not the address you wanted. Prime Ministers actually avoided living there. It was damp, it was cramped, and it was expensive.
It wasn't even number 10 to begin with. It was renumbered in 1779. Before that, it was number 5.
And in 1839, the building was in such bad shape, there were actually plans to tear it down.
It survived, barely, and it wasn't even the closest it comes to disaster.
Quick one, the door wasn't always black. In the early 1900s, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith painted the door dark green.
The moment he left, the door was painted straight back to black. And when workers finally cleaned the brickwork, they discovered it wasn't even dark at all.
They were bright yellow. This was from centuries worth of soot and pollution staining it black the entire time.
Now, the door with no handle. In February 1991, the IRA fired a mortar bomb in the back of the garden. It exploded close enough to the cabinet room where the ministers were having a meeting inside.
After that, the wooden door got replaced by a reinforced door, one that was blast resistant, and most importantly, one that didn't have a handle on the outside. It only opened from the inside with someone on a camera feed watching.
And now, remember the boggy ground from a minute ago? The shallow foundations Sir George Downing built on in 1682?
Well, by the late 50s, they finally caught up with the building, and the inspectors found rotting timber, dry rot, and a cabinet room that could genuinely collapse at any minute.
So between 1960 and 1963, under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, number 10 was completely rebuilt. Nearly 2/3 of the structure was replaced.
And that black door at the front of the building is pretty much the last honest piece from the original building.
So, was it ever just a normal house?
For about 5 minutes, yes. One rental unit in a cheap terrace, built by a guy trying to save money on foundations that he really shouldn't have cheapened out on.
And everything else was basically rebuilt from the ground up.